Stand by. 20 seconds. 15 seconds. 10. 5 seconds. 2. And action.
About 200 kilometres or 155 miles east of Paris and just south of Luxembourg lies the thriving little town of Metz. As with many places across Europe, the city and its cathedral are linked by a history spanning the centuries. Consecrated on the 27th of June 1039, the cathedral stands as a testament to the skillful architecture of that generation. But what's intriguing of this church is the identity of one of the statues just to the right of the front doors. The statue is supposed to be that of Daniel the prophet. It is, in fact, that of Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was a young and ambitious leader with his mind set on ruling a large world empire. The vision of global power was not realized, and that the prophecies of Daniel still stand true. He would have done well to have taken closer note of the chapter in Daniel that we're about to study. Today's study will take us to the chapter which will help unlock all of the other prophetic chapters found in the book of Daniel. It's an important lesson. It's important because Daniel chapter 2 establishes an outline prophecy. It covers world history in one broad sweep from the era of Daniel right through to the end of time. Each of the following prophecies in the book of Daniel cover the same time period, but with far more depth and detail. And while each of the following prophecies use various symbols, they only serve to repeat and expand what has already been laid out for us in the chapter we're about to study right now. So let's welcome Jeff Yilden as he presents to us conflict through the centuries.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Anthony, for your welcome, and a very big welcome to those in our live audience today, as well as those watching our program on video. This is certainly one of the most amazing prophecies ever recorded. And in a moment we're going to notice together this wonderful, intriguing prophecy. But first, just a little background from our last program together. You'll remember that Daniel and his friends had been marched on the grueling trek from Jerusalem to Babylon. And as was often done, the king chose the very best of the young captives for re-education in the ways of Babylon. This re-education was to last for 3 years. And Daniel and his friends were offered the food and wine the king ate and drank. But they suggested that they be permitted to have a simple diet in keeping with the instructions that God had given. And as the story tells us, within 10 days, they had not only looked healthier, but God blessed them for their faithfulness to principle. Not only were they the best scholars in the university, but they were 10 times better than anyone else in the realm. And so Daniel was promoted to be one of the king's advisors or wise men of Babylon. You see, Babylon was one of the greatest empires that ever existed. It's been referred to as the Golden City. And it attained that status during the reign of its greatest king, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nabopolassar, his father, died while Nebuchadnezzar was campaigning in the far reaches of the Babylonian Empire. And when news came through of his father's death, Nebuchadnezzar took his horse and galloped across the Syrian deserts. Because back in those days, when a king died, there was often insurrection. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted to re-establish his claim to the throne. And he was successful, and so for the next 44 years, he reigned in prosperity and victory over the surrounding nations. Then Babylon enjoyed unparalleled prosperity and became a thriving city. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was attributed to Nebuchadnezzar. You see, Nebuchadnezzar married the daughter of Cyaxares. Now, she wasn't used to the dry, hot deserts, and Nebuchadnezzar, being an ideal husband, wanted to make his wife happy. So he decided to build an artificial mountain and beautiful hanging gardens. Now, we don't know whether he succeeded in making his wife happy, but we certainly know that he built one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. You see, Nebuchadnezzar was to play an important role in the outlining of a prophecy that would span the ages. But how is it that the God of heaven would choose to use a pagan king in the process of revealing the future? Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth, was to become the most frustrated man on earth. Now, the story that's detailed in the 2nd chapter of Daniel is fascinating. So let's journey back now in time as we return to ancient Babylon and look at the events that led to this amazing prophecy.
Have you ever woken one morning knowing that the dream you'd just been dreaming was very important, but you couldn't remember it? This happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king awoke with a start. He sensed a strong foreboding. The dream. He couldn't remember the dream. It was important, he knew that much, but for the life of him, he couldn't recall it. He summoned his servant and demanded that all of the wise men of the court be assembled immediately. The wise men included magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers.
This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble.
But the wise men argued that
there is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician, or enchanter, or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult.
this made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all of the wise men of Babylon. Daniel was among the wise men and was destined for the same fate. When the executioner came for them, Daniel asked to see the king. He begged the king for more time. As they had before in their hour of need, Daniel and his friends approached the Lord with their problem. That night, as Daniel slept, God revealed both the dream and its interpretation to him. When he woke up, Daniel's first response was to praise God.
Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given to me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king.
No doubt Daniel was overjoyed that God had revealed the dream to him that night. Once again, his faith was rewarded. He had approached the king with the confidence that his God would be able to solve the mystery, and he did. I imagine that he just couldn't wait to tell King Nebuchadnezzar of his dream and its interpretation. So Daniel approached the king, and this is what he said in the 2nd chapter of Daniel. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king." So it was clear that the wise men of Babylon, including the astrologers, could not fulfill the king's request to interpret his dream. These wise men of Babylon, by the way, were hand-picked, and they were some of the most intelligent men in the ancient world. They were vital to the king. In fact, Sir Leonard Woolley, the archaeologist who excavated in Babylonia during the years 1922 to 1934, revealed that the Sumerian civilization was one of the world's most brilliant civilizations. And the wise men of Babylon had a remarkable understanding of mathematics and astronomy, trigonometry, and the other sciences. In fact, many believe that these sciences began with the Sumerians. In fact, Josephus, the Jewish historian, in commenting about Egypt, he makes this statement: Abraham communicated to them, that is, to the Egyptians, arithmetic, and delivered to them the science of astronomy. For before Abraham came into Egypt, they were unacquainted with these facets of learning. You see, that science came from the Chaldeans into Egypt. So these wise men of Babylon were indeed some of the world's wisest and most learned men. Yet this dream had made such an impact upon King Nebuchadnezzar that he was prepared to sacrifice all of them. They had completely proved that they were inadequate to reveal the king's dream and the future. And yet there are thousands today who would trust the wise men of the world for wisdom, and even more who would never start the day without consulting their star charts, seeking what the modern astrologers say. I'd like to remind you that the so-called wise men today are no wiser in helping to understand the issues of life than they were back there in Daniel's day. The astrologers have no more insight into what will happen in the future than they did when Daniel walked on the earth. You see, both these groups failed to reveal the meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But I want you to notice now what Daniel went on to say. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. In other words, God is the one who can reveal the dream and its meaning. And I'd like you to notice that the dream concerns the latter days. In other words, God had revealed to Daniel the whole history of mankind from the very days of Babylon to our own day. That's why I find this prophecy so exciting. It comes right down to our own day. And as Daniel continues, as he says here, "As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be." Well, by this time, the king was listening intently to Daniel, who then went on to remind Nebuchadnezzar what he had dreamed about, as well as to give him the interpretation. This is what he said. "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." And of course, the whole dream came back to the king. You know, it must have been a fairly awesome looking image that Nebuchadnezzar saw. Imagine this: head of gold, breasts and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet part of iron and part of clay. Then Nebuchadnezzar saw a large rock which struck the image upon its feet, breaking it in pieces, and it was carried away in the wind. Then the stone which struck the image became a great mountain and filled the entire earth. As you can see, it's not your everyday dream, but its meaning was deeply significant. In fact, one of the wonderful things about the Bible is the fact that it always explains itself. You know, many people have been told that you have to put your own interpretation upon the Bible. Now, it is true that many people do put their own interpretation in the Bible, and this helps to explain why we have so many different ideas and interpretations about the Bible. But this is the wrong way to study the Bible and prophecy. This is not the way the Bible says it is to be studied. Because there's a simple principle that the Bible clearly teaches, and that is to allow the Bible to be its own interpreter. We don't have to guess and put our own interpretation upon the prophecies at all. In fact, notice how the Bible interprets itself. As Daniel went on to explain to the king, "This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold." You are this head of gold. Can you imagine how pleased Nebuchadnezzar must have felt to hear the fact that he was the head of gold? You see, as the head of state, Nebuchadnezzar represented Babylon. Gold was used, by the way, lavishly in the adornment of the Babylonian buildings, particularly in the temples dedicated to the god Merodach, who was known as the god of gold. The precious metal was used extensively to glorify both the gods and the king. And Nebuchadnezzar emphasized this practice by ordering the construction of a golden image as an act of worship. That was going to be as a test of loyalty. And by the way, we're going to look at this in our next program. Historians refer to Babylon as a golden city. And so the symbol that is here used to describe Babylon is one that would have been easily recognized by Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon was one of the greatest empires of antiquity, and it ruled the then known world from 606 to 539 BC. Some time ago, they found a burned clay tablet that was dug up in the ruins of old Babylon, and it concerns Nebuchadnezzar's palace. And on it, it was a statement made by the same king in which these words are recorded: "Babylon, the city which is the delight of my eyes, which I have glorified, may it last forever." Notice the words again of the prophet as he records what was going to happen. "But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours." Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar saw that breasts and arms of silver? What a disappointment. After a long reign, the great king died. And we find history telling us that weak kings followed until finally Babylon fell in the year 539 BC, while Daniel was still living in Babylon. You see, just as silver is inferior to gold, so the kingdom that followed Babylon would be inferior to her. The Medes and Persians, a dual empire like Austria-Hungary, followed Babylon. In fact, on a clay cylinder discovered by archaeologists, Cyrus describes his capture of the city of Babylon. He gives himself this title: "I am Cyrus, king of the world, the great king, the mighty king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters of the earth." Now the Medes and Persians became equal with, in fact even superior to Babylon in the extent of their empire, but inferior in glory, just as silver is inferior to gold. And the Medes and the Persians reigned from 538 to 331 BC. Now, the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus is a very interesting point of history. You see, 150 years before Cyrus was even born, the prophet Isaiah had actually named Cyrus as the one who would conquer Babylon. Now you think of that. 150 years before he was even born, he was named by the prophet of God. That would be the equivalent of predicting who will be the president of the United States in the 22nd century and actually naming him. But Cyrus came up against those impregnable walls of Babylon. Now the Babylonians weren't concerned about the Persian army outside their city because they knew their walls were secure. In fact, so unconcerned were they that that night in Babylon, the night Babylon fell, they had a feast for the nobles and leaders. What the Persian leader did was to divert the waters of the river into an artificial lake so that the water level dropped. He then had 1/3 of his army march against the walls and walk underneath the walls as the water level dropped. You see, the river Euphrates flowed through the city. But even then they would have been caught like rats in a trap if it hadn't been for that very night the gates that went down into the river had been left open. You see, the Babylonians anticipated that someone might do what Cyrus did in diverting the water. So what they did is they constructed those gates to stop an enemy who might happen to break through the wall. That's why they went right down into the riverbed. And so that very night, great Babylonian empire came to an end. And while Nebuchadnezzar sat spellbound, Daniel continued in his interpretation of this prophecy. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours. Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. The third kingdom of brass was the great Grecian Macedonian power led by Alexander the Great. You see, Alexander defeated the Persians at the Battle of Arbela in 331 BC. Gold, silver, now brass. Notice how each of the metals is inferior to the preceding one. Alexander the Great was perhaps the greatest general in history. He was admired and envied and studied by men like Hannibal, Caesar, Napoleon, Montgomery, and virtually every cadet in military academy. His broad vision and questing mind put him head and shoulders above every other conqueror. But only figuratively, for Alexander was unusually short, probably little over 5 feet tall, or 1.5 meters in height. He was said to be handsome, with a prominent nose and jutting jaw. And he was the youngest of all the great conquerors, master of Asia at 22 and mighty Persia at 25. Now, in the year 336 BC, King Philip, Alexander's father, was assassinated, and nearly all his conquered peoples revolted. They had nothing to fear, or so they thought, from this callow youth who was now their king. But Alexander, striking out to the north and to the east and to the west and to the south, finally to Greece proper, conquered all in his path. And he then prepared for the Greek crusade into Asia to punish the Persians for having invaded Greece some 150 years before. Persia was the richest empire, more powerful by far than any state in the Western world. Alexander had little more than 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. And it's said that when finally news got through of the small force that he was bringing and it reached Darius III, he laughed. As the vast Persian empire of possibly about 1 million soldiers lined up for the final battle in that now what is called modern Iraq, Alexander's force seemed like a tiny little island about to be engulfed by a tidal wave. Then Alexander decided the outcome with a classical maneuver that he'd learnt from his father. While his centre drew the main attack upon itself, he led a wild but disciplined cavalry charge out around his right wing, then struck in to catch the enemy's unguarded flank. At one point he came almost near enough to strike Darius with his spear, but the Persian king broke away and fled, eventually to be assassinated by his own men, and his army collapsed in disarray. Alexander was only 32 when he died in 323 BC. having conquered an empire stretching from the country once known as Yugoslavia to India, and including all of parts of Bulgaria, Israel, Egypt, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and the former Soviet Union. More than 2.5 centuries later, Julius Caesar wept to read about how much Alexander had accomplished by that age, and chided himself for being a failure. After Alexander's death, his kingdom was divided amongst 4 of his generals. But it became weaker and weaker until finally it passed under the control of the 4th empire of prophecy. Notice. And the 4th kingdom shall be strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters all things, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. After the Grecian Empire fell in 168 BC, the next world empire was Rome, which continued until 476 AD. And it was Rome, by the way, who ruled the world when Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem. You think of it. Here with unerring accuracy, Daniel has foretold world history for 1,000 years. We have the rise and fall of nations. Babylon followed by Medo-Persia, Medo-Persia followed by Greece, and then, of course, Greece followed by Rome. History records that in the western part of the world, which of course this prophecy is dealing with, there have only been 4 world powers. Babylon represented by the head of gold, Medo-Persia represented by the breasts and arms of silver, Greece represented by the belly and thighs of brass, and now Rome represented by the legs of iron. Now listen, I need to read you a statement from Edward Gibbon in his book, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And in writing about this very same period of history, he uses some of the same phraseology. Now, Edward Gibbon, of course, wrote last century, and his history is regarded as a classic. Listen to what he says. The armies of the Republic, sometimes vanquished in battle, always victorious in war, advance with rapid steps to the Euphrates, the Danube, the Rhine, and the ocean. And the images of gold, or silver, or brass, that might serve to represent the nations and their kings, were successively broken by the iron monarchy of Rome. Now, nobody would even suggest that Gibbon was friendly with the Bible or God. He was an infidel and sarcastic as far as the Bible was concerned. This, to my mind, is what makes this statement all the more amazing. He uses the same imagery as the prophet nearly 2,500 years before. Gold, silver, brass, and iron. You know, I've often thought if you have 4 universal world empires, Babylon followed by Medo-Persia, then Medo-Persia followed by Greece, and Greece followed by Rome, you would naturally expect that when Rome went down, it too would be followed by a 5th and a 6th, and so on. But the prophet said history will not repeat itself. Notice what he said. Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. The prophet said now that the kingdom following Rome would become divided. And then it goes on to say, and as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. Once again, the prophet said after the division into those representing the toes, those 10 divisions, then some of them were going to be strong like iron, some were going to be fragile like clay, ceramic clay. The prophet Daniel said Rome would go down. It would be split up into many divisions, some of which would be strong, some of which would be fragile or weak. Now it's interesting that around 410 AD the barbarian tribes conquered Rome. They were the Goths under Alaric who came down. They were followed by the Huns led by Attila, And then the Vandals from the northern part of Africa under Genseric invaded Italy. And gradually Rome was obliged to yield more and more of its territory until 10 of these tribes became known as modern Europe. They were the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, the Servi, the Vandals, the Alani, the Anglo-Saxons, the Heruli, the Lombards, and the Burgundians. By the way, 7 of them still exist in Europe today. For example, the Anglo-Saxons became the English, the Franks became the French, and the Lombards became the Italians. Now, in a later lesson, we're going to read the fascinating story of the power that destroyed 3 of these 10 divisions. But you think of it, this amazing prophecy here given over 2,000 years before by a Hebrew prophet had actually predicted there would be 4 great world empires ruling over the Western world. And following the 4th, when it fell, it was going to be divided into these divisions. Nebuchadnezzar's attention was then directed and diverted to these divisions of modern Europe today. Listen to what Daniel said as he described these divisions. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Apparently there's going to be a plan to unite Europe through marriage, alliances, and other means. You see, the expression here in verse 43 when it says they will mingle themselves with the seed of men simply means they will try into marriage. Now, if you go back to the First World War, it was really a big family squabble because the rulers of England and Russia and Greece, Norway, Germany, and Denmark, they were all related. And the prophet said they would try into marriage, but it will not work. In fact, listen again to Daniel's prophecy here in the 2nd chapter. But they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. You know, over the centuries, men have endeavored to unite Europe. I think of Charlemagne in the 8th century. Then there was Charles V in the 16th century. Then Louis XIV in the 18th century, and Napoleon in the 19th century. By the way, it was Napoleon who said, in 5 years, I shall be master of the world. There shall be no repose in Europe until it is under one head, under one emperor, whose officers shall be kings. When the Tsar of Russia reminded Napoleon that man proposes but God disposes, Napoleon retorted, I propose and I dispose. Providence is on the side of the heaviest artillery. Then came the fatal march into Russia. Asked how he hoped to defeat the French, Tsar Alexander said, I depend on 2 generals, January and February. It was the arsenal of snow and ice and frost that finally defeated Napoleon. And as we know, Waterloo was his doom. Kaiser Wilhelm and Adolf Hitler made 2 unforgettable 20th century attempts to rebuild the empire of the Caesars. The Kaiser tried to defy Daniel's prophecy. This is the reason he offered to re-roof the Cathedral of Metz if the head of the statue of Daniel were replaced with a likeness of his own. But it was the Kaiser's head that eventually rolled. Adolf Hitler boasted that he would change the history of the world for 1,000 years to come. But Hitler has come and gone. Communism, led by the old Soviet Union, is a spent force. It's fascinating to watch events in Europe today in the light of this prophecy, where today even the European community is finding it difficult to bring such diverse powers as France and Germany and England together. The prophet said, they will not hold together. Iron and clay are 2 metals that cannot join together with any permanency. Iron and clay cannot be mixed with an alloy. This figure means that there will never be a permanent United States of Europe. According to this prophecy, we can expect no peaceful world government until the next event of prophecy takes place. Conflict is to continue until that stone kingdom of Jesus Christ comes. You know, over the years, men have tried to unite Europe, but these words have thwarted every effort. No one up to this present time has been able to unite Europe, and according to the prophecy, they never will. Then the king remembered that stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands and hit the image upon its feet and broke it in pieces. It became, remember, a great mountain and filled the entire earth. Daniel explained to the king what this meant. And in the days of these kings, that is, while Europe is divided and is seeking unity, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it will stand forever. In other words, the next universal kingdom will be the kingdom of God. And this kingdom will not simply be a takeover of earthly kingdoms, it will completely destroy and blow away all the kingdoms of this earth. This is the wonderful kingdom the New Testament speaks about when God will create a new heavens and a new earth. This kingdom will last forever and will bring all conflict to an end. You know, during the last war, the World War, the Allied infantry blazed away all night at an Axis fortress. And in the grey dawn of the new day, the infantry rushed forward with fixed bayonets to occupy the post. They succeeded, and without any opposition at all, for you see, under cover of darkness, the enemy garrison had evacuated, leaving their dead behind. The captain of the brigade had not expected it to be so easy, and he relaxed to take stock of the situation. And rounding a corner, he was confronted by the figure of a wounded Italian officer in full regalia. His stripes and regalia indicated his rank. The Allied soldier stooped down and picked up the medals and decorations to search for some clue as to who the man was. Then he noticed something held firmly in the grip of the dying man's hand. It was a diary, which his fingers had opened. And at a glance he could see the story. On the one side, the smiling face of a woman in her early 40s. On the other side, a beautiful little girl with long flowing hair. The Allied captain, who was a Christian, gulped once or twice in silence as other men gathered around and took in the situation. Then, as he reverently closed the man's notebook, that battle-hardened leader prayed a prayer punctuated with sobs. Merciful God, come quickly, send Jesus Christ to put a stop to this shameful work of the devil. Jesus Christ is the only answer to the problems of the nations and to our own personal problems. You know, I like the certainty of the prophecy when everything else seems to be falling around us. Notice what the prophet said. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure. You see, the Bible declares that when Jesus Christ returns to earth the second time, he will crush the kingdoms of earth and establish an everlasting kingdom that will have no end. To me, this is very, very exciting news. Christ is soon to return, and God is in control of human history. We know it must be soon because the stone hits the feet of iron and clay in the time of the division of Europe, while those nations are seeking unity. In other words, in the very days in which we live. And all history moves towards this climactic event when the Son of Man will come in majesty to bring peace and everlasting righteousness. You know, Nebuchadnezzar might have thought that he was in control when he took God's people captive in chapter 1 and 2. But chapter 2 of Daniel clearly demonstrates that God is ruler over all and that he will ultimately win the conflict. It may have appeared, had you been living during the reign of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, that God was not in control, just as it appears sometimes today that the nations of the earth are in control of our lives and our destiny. But it's not true. It's not true today any more than it was true in times past. Jesus is coming soon, and we must be prepared for that event. Even King Nebuchadnezzar recognized that Daniel's God was indeed a God of gods and a King of kings, that he was above all the earthly gods of Babylon. And we see how quickly the picture has changed. Now Daniel becomes chief of the governors over the wise men of Babylon, and his three friends rulers over the province of Babylon. You see, God honors our commitment to him, and of course, he still does that today. In this episode, we've studied a very important lesson. The prophecy that we have studied is the foundation upon which all the other prophecies in Daniel will build. Now, there are a number of elements to this, and it's very important to have them firmly in our mind. So let's take one final look at the way God sent King Nebuchadnezzar the mysterious dream, how Daniel interpreted it, and how it applies to our world today.
Daniel now ruled over the entire province of Babylon. He was elevated to this position because he was able to solve Nebuchadnezzar's great dilemma. The dilemma involved a dream that troubled him all night, a dream that he knew was important, a dream that he couldn't remember. His wise men couldn't help him, not even under the threat of death.
This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble.
But because of his relationship with the God of heaven, Daniel was able to explain and interpret the dream that Nebuchadnezzar could not remember. He was able to show the king that the image in his dream was a representation of kingdoms or powers that would dominate the world until the end of time. He explained to Nebuchadnezzar that the various metals of the image identified different nations, and that the head of gold represented the kingdom of Babylon itself. Within the book of Daniel, chapter 2 is very important. It is the prophecy which lays the foundation upon which all of the other prophecies are built. It is an outline prophecy, a prophecy upon which other prophecies in later chapters will expand and give further detail. But in today's world, there is probably a more important message from this chapter. God not only knows the future, he reveals the future. Is a place of uncertainty, but God knows what will happen. Most importantly, God is in control of history. He is the one who sends the rock which smashes the other kingdoms to pieces. He is the one who will bring order out of chaos, setting up the final kingdom of the prophecy. That kingdom will be a kingdom of peace, a kingdom that will never end, a kingdom that will last forever.
Well, that final kingdom of prophecy will certainly be a magnificent one not to be missed. You know, it would be a tragedy if one were not a part of that great climax in history. We know that the final kingdom is about to be ushered in because all of the other kingdoms, the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, and the iron and clay, have all existed throughout history just as the prophet Daniel predicted. You know, I've often thought, as I have studied this prophecy, if the prophecy was right when it predicted Babylon would be followed by Medo-Persia, and it was right when it said that the Medo-Persians would be followed by the Greeks, and it was right when it said the Greeks would be followed by the Romans, and it was right when it said that the Romans would be followed by a divided Europe, and it was right when it said the nations of Europe, some would be strong and others weak, and it was right when it said that Europe would never ever unite again, and it was right when it said that men would try all sorts of ways to bring unity to Europe. It's probably also right when it says that the next great empire will be the setting up of God's kingdom. Tell you what confidence that we can have in the author of these prophecies, and what confidence we can have in the one who inspired the prophets, the God of heaven. Surely, he's the one who's in control of human history. You know, I'm so thankful for a God who's in control, aren't you? A God whom we can trust. A God who is interested in us individually. A God who wants us to triumph with him. You know, I feel today that I would like to tell the Lord that I want to have Jesus take control of my life. You know, if you'd like to join me in making that decision, you might like to pick up your piece of paper and your pencil or pen and write on these words that you can see now on the screen in just a moment. You know, if you have that piece of paper and a pencil, you can write this down. I would like to have Jesus Christ take control of my life. Why don't we all write that down on our piece of paper? I would like to have Jesus Christ take control of my life. Let me explain why I believe it's important to do this. You see, when the Lord impresses us and we fail to respond, it becomes more difficult for us to decide in the future. I always make it a practice myself that when the Lord impresses me to respond, I respond. So let me encourage you to write that on that piece of paper, the statement indicating that you want Jesus to take control of your life. You may then like to put that piece of paper where you can read it often to reaffirm your decision. Could I also suggest that for future meetings you keep a piece of paper like this to take notes, because each program, each lecture we go through, there are important points, and no doubt you'll want to remember those points as we go down, and writing them helps you to remember those important points. Let us just bow our heads together in prayer. Our wonderful Father in heaven, we thank you for the prophecy that we have studied together today. We thank you that you have outlined through history and through the book of Daniel what was going to happen in the future, right down to the very day in which we live. And as we see the events taking place in Europe, where your word has said that the nations of Europe, some being strong and some weak, will never ever unite again. And we thank you for that great stone that strikes the image upon its feet and becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. And we understand that to be the return of Jesus, that Jesus is coming back soon. And just as every aspect of the prophecy has been fulfilled to the very letter, our faith believes that your coming also is going to be just as you have outlined. Dear Lord, bless every person here today, bless every viewer that is watching this program, and together help us to be ready for that wonderful day when Jesus will come soon. We ask for Jesus' sake. Amen. You know, in our next program together, we're going to look at the 3rd and the 4th chapters of Daniel and see how the erecting of an image in Babylon has its sequel in the last days, and how God was able to convert old Nebuchadnezzar. I tell you, it's a thrilling story, and I hope that you'll be able to join us then. Till then, may God bless you all.